Evening, everyone. Why I always forget about that thing. I apologize. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Basics of Marxism. I'm really excited about this tonight. We have a very special guest lecturer, my brother Carlos Garrido, who is going to sort of help us apply everything we've been learning in this class to the modern day left. uh, what we can do, what's wrong, how we got to here, how we got from there to here, and where we can go from here. Um, I'm sure he needs no real introduction. So, with that, take it away, brother.
Hey, what's up, everyone? It's great to see a lot of new faces. I also see some faces I recognize. I don't see Slava's face, but I know Slava very well. By the way, just a quick plug. I'll be with Slava and the Chicago Workers' School and the Revolution Report the 13th of July to discuss the new book, Why We Need American Marxism. So if you're in the Chicago area, make sure to. Oh, I see Steph got it. I recognize Steph, of course, from class. I recognize the comrade Pramod over there. Shout out to you, Pramod, Daniel, of course. Um, my apologies if I'm missing anyone else who's in my class and I haven't seen. Um, I think it'd be good uh, to have the discussion on the purity fetish center in part around the question of why it is that the Midwestern Marx Institute came to be about in the first place. Because in terms of my personal trajectory, what I think of this book as is almost as the place where we're able to crystallize and put on paper some of the original kernels for why we decided that something like the Midwestern Marx Institute was worth pursuing. And after 3 to 4 years of working together, growing our team, thinking over and over and over about the same ideas, such that each time we come back to it and reinvestigate it and reflect on it more, they get more refined. And this book is a product of that. In many ways, I consider it a collective effort. I'm the one that put pen to paper, but it wouldn't have been possible without Noah's encouragement, without Noah's notes, without the many conversations that I had with Noah. And the same could be said about Eddie and Tom as well. So in many ways, this is the first text that puts in writing what we can consider to be the Institute's unique contribution to the ever evolving and alive body of knowledge of Marxism. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why it is that we started the Institute, because like I mentioned, I think it rolls nicely into the book. Eddie and I had been working all throughout undergrad uh, in our communities in Dubuque. It's a beautiful little town in the eastern part of Illinois, not Iowa, with a bridge to Illinois and a bridge to Wisconsin. So it was a very Midwestern city. Um, I think the city's nickname is the Miracle on the Mississippi. It's a beautiful little Midwestern town, as Midwestern as you can possibly get. And for the 4 years that I was there, I was primarily working with the local DSA um, to organize locally, do various missions, and focus on the needs of our community in Dubuque. By the last year, Bernie runs again, and we decide to reorient some of the efforts that we had within the university and within the community to uh, to the Bernie campaign, and that's where I come to meet Eddie. Um, Already in that time organizing an undergrad, we had seen really various flaws in the institutional left that we had engaged with. There was a group of other Iowa University socialist clubs that we brought together, and the idea was that whenever any one of us in the state, which is not that large, was doing something big, we can pull all of the strengths from the different university socialist clubs to each one. We had various serious meetings to discuss this in Iowa City, and nothing ever materialized. And I noticed that within these sort of university spaces, there was this really strange framework of thinking about socialism. Um, there was what I would uh, articulate afterwards as a form of national nihilism. A lot of them saw socialism as basically the abolishment of America. Slogans such as "Death to America" were quite common, and that was very strange to me, specifically as as a Cuban immigrant. The only the only sort of social spaces that I witnessed um, participate in that sort of rhetoric that considered it wrong for me to have some sort of rootedness in the American trajectory were folks from the right and like ultra conservatives that wanted to have a conception of America that's tied to the sort of white purity. You could only be American if you're white. You have to be non-immigrant, non-black, et cetera, et cetera. But here I was seeing it from like the so-called left. Um, this very nihilistic and reductive view of America, and it was not at all how I had come up to that point to think about the country. Most of the inspiration that I drew from in terms of socialism were basically from what I would be able to later describe as the Black Freedom Movement. I was very influenced by the Panthers. I was very influenced by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Um, I was actually influenced by the African Blood Brotherhood, which I had read about quite early on. These group of Black Marxist Leninists in New York who ended up eventually merging into the CPUSA after it gets founded in 1919. So I was drawing from this tradition, and I was beginning to understand America as a sort of social totality that has these opposing forces, the forces that, of course, stand for empire, the forces that have stood on the side of the genocide of the native populations, the enslavement of African peoples, sexism against women, general exploitation of working people, imperialism. But then always, wherever there's that, there's always going to be its opposite. There's always going to be resistance. And I intuitively understood that for me, I identified with an American project that was more tied to those forces that stood on the side of resistance. And I very early on came to identify with something that Noah has been able to articulate as the American trajectory, which is the idea that it's that progressive struggle that actually moves America forward. Because as dialectical materialists, as you should have learned in this class, and I'm sure you did, we analyze things in their movement. We try to prevent any sort of epistemology, any way of knowing the world, of addressing the questions of knowledge, which removes things from their context. We want to understand things in their context and in the movement in which they exist in. So I felt that the movement towards a more progressive America that was embodied in these figures that I was pulling from, which could include Debs, et cetera. I saw, perhaps wrongly, Bernie in that tradition as well. Um, I felt that that represented like the real America in many ways. I saw what I would find later on Dr. King speaking of in terms of the two Americas. And the one that stood for progress, I understood it as the real America. And here I was with these groups of anarchists and other forms of ultra leftists in Iowa who were thinking about things completely different. And just from the practical experience that I had, it didn't make much sense. It didn't make sense theoretically. I felt like their understanding of America was very reductive. Why are you going to reduce a totality in motion to one of its aspects and not understand it dialectically, not understand the objective contradictions at play? But also practically, I don't think that anyone that I interacted with, any regular working class person that I was able to interact with in the thousands of doors that we knocked campaigning for Bernie, which was kind of for Bernie, but it was mostly us just talking about socialism with regular working people. I don't think any of them would have opened the door or kept me inside their homes for very long if I would have introduced socialism as abolish America. You should feel guilty about all of American history, all of your cultural traditions that you love and embody. This thing, the 4th of July that we have coming up, you shouldn't celebrate it. You should describe it as something else. And I don't think I would have been able to speak to anyone in that form. I had much more success painting to the American people the image of America that I kind of spontaneously came to. So that was one flaw that I noticed. And it was tied to seeing videos. This wasn't really happening in the Midwest, but I was seeing videos from like New York and other parts of the country where in protest people would like come out and burn the American flag. And it was like the leftist thing to do. And I also didn't understand that because the all the figures that I loved, um, they were able, on the basis of understanding that contradiction that America as a social totality embodies, they were able to understand the contradiction inherent in the symbols themselves. I was looking at King's speeches, and the American flag was behind it. I was looking at, Paul Robeson's famous defense at HEWAC, where he says, "No, you anti-communists, you guys are the real anti-patriots. It's me and my communist friend Ben Davis. We're the real patriots." So there was, the way I ended up thinking about it was that these people were kind of taking the gun that McCarthyism pointed at the left, which said, look, there's this big gap, this big divide between America and the values the American people appreciate, and socialism, Marxism, communism. It's the big antithesis. Um, this myth that was propelled by McCarthyism, in many ways, these leftists reappropriated it, and they took the gun that McCarthy was pointing at the left and just like took it away from McCarthy's hand and just pointed it at themselves. I could not really comprehend that very much. Another issue that I saw that was quite prominent, and it's one that I kind of.
Carlos, give me 1 second. If anyone has a mic open, I keep hearing a little bit of like background noise. Could you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Another issue that I dragged because I had came from Miami where I had done a little bit of organizing as well, and it's a more cosmopolitan setting, was the idea that the whole Midwest was just a bunch of white bigots. I remember I got recruited to the Midwest to play baseball after many injuries. Career ended up not working out, as you can obviously tell. Um, but the first thing the scout that hooked me up told me was, you have to be careful. That's not Miami. I mean, at that point, I had maybe met like 5 white Americans in my life. They're scaring the shit out of me, telling me that you really have to be careful. You have to be on the constant lookout. And I was frightened as how I went up that first trip with my dad and my wife, and we were just constantly on the lookout. And one of the things that I noticed was that the people I interacted with were extremely hospitable. They were super nice. Um, and in those 4 years that I spent in Iowa, um, I got to meet regular working class people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and that whole image of, like, for instance, the MAGA part of the working class as being these racist bigots that understand "Make America Great Again" as "Make America White," or "Make America," take it back to like segregation. That was not the practical experience that I had. Um, the experience that I did have was people who had voted for Obama twice, and who certainly had hope in Obama. Obama, for those that don't remember, like the first time around at least, it was somewhat similar to Bernie. Like it seemed like a progressive candidacy that can actually do something for working people and marginalized communities. And these working class people had become a part of that. And what they noticed was that they just got shafted. That he continued the tendency that had long been in place of abandoning the working class's interests, propelling austerity, passing measures that had the veneer of helping working people, but not really. Um, and the way that they understood Trump and also Bernie, which is something that's never hardly ever talked about, the interconnection of Trump and Bernie in those years, um, was as genuine political outsiders, as people that were actually anti-establishment. They weren't the sort of traditional politician figures. And when the MAGA people understood the way they understood "Make America Great Again," and again, this is the experience of the Midwest. Like I'm sure there's parts of the South where "again" means white, but the way they understood "again" was like make America like it was when my parents and grandparents were able to work one job, one 40-hour a week job, have security, go out to dinner on weekends, not have to worry about, overspending or something, take a few vacations a year. They wanted to make America like that 25-year period where we actually had a very stable and large middle class, where middle class literally meant half of the country lives in this position. And that was, of course, a reality that was primarily experienced in the white working class. But by the way, these people saw their lives deteriorating. They saw their lives plagued by debt. They came to see how progressively what they made in wages at the end of the month left them scrambling to figure out how to make ends meet, and they wanted to go back to a position of financial stability. And that's partly how they understood Trump's message, and Trump was able to feed into that. He presented a very anti-establishment discourse. Um, he said at one point that he was going to basically pass Medicare for all, take us out of all of the wars, and bring back industry, which in the Midwest, where the industry that was the foundation of those good paying jobs left because of NAFTA and neoliberalism and the crisis of the 1970s of capitalism. When they heard that, they were like, "Oh, this is the chance that we have to regain that stability." And then the slogan "Make America Great Again," the reference point was those 25 years where for their parents there was some stability, and that was the case. Now that was the case, of course, because we live in the belly of the beast, where because of the imperialist super profits, you could have redistributed some of the crumbs. It was also the case because we had a very strong communist party and labor movement that was able to win those concessions from the capitalist class. And it was the case, thirdly, because we had the existence of a Soviet Union that was thriving and that presented a real alternative that created the conditions for the possibility that if people's material conditions weren't well, they would begin rocking the boat and be able to see an alternative right in front of them, where working class people were actually in power and governing their own future, where there was actually a society of, by, and for the people, as we were promised here in America. So I get to the Midwest, and this myth, this cosmopolitan myth of what the Midwestern MAGA worker was like, was completely popped. When I talked to a lot of these people, they were extremely anti-establishment. The term, which is not employed very much recently, but fake news was one that they had at the tip of their lip. And what is the bourgeois media in its totality, including, of course, Fox News and the media of the right, if not fake news? And it's very easy once someone already comes to accept that at least a part of it is based on lies and deception for the interest of a ruling elite. It's very easy just to get them to expand that lens. For those familiar with it, there's this blue paper towel that's used by mechanics. I'm sure some of you have seen it. But if you try to tear it from the part that doesn't have the tear, it's virtually impossible. You can't. Like the fabric is so strong that you can't. So the only way to tear it is in those little slithers where the tail tears are at. And the smallest bit of a tear is what creates the condition for you to rip the whole thing open. This is how I was thinking about these people's assessment of fake news. As soon as they came to understand that at least a part of the media was fake news, all I had to do was say, well, look at the other media. They're funded by the same interest. It's six major companies that own 95% of the media. And if they were able to make that extension, then you take it to, well, let's think about other ideological apparatuses. Let's think about education. Let's think about how they tell us about history, what history is emphasized, what history is distorted, who are the bad guys. in terms of history? What history is completely ignored or domesticated? Is it the real MOK that we celebrate on MOK Day? Is it the real MOK that our politicians pay lip service to? Was it the MOK that Hoover described as the most dangerous man in America? I don't think so. So on the basis of that already spontaneous, organic form of dissent, I found it very easy to take these people from that position, MAGA, to socialism. And in fact, the university club that we had, which had around 10 people in it in the central committee, and then in events, we would gather a few dozen people. But in the central committee, I think there was like 7 or 8 that were previous MAGA people. So we had incredible success winning people over from that position. This was well before there was any MAGA communist ideas circulating online. Um, and the contrast was that when we would get sent out, for instance, by the Bernie campaign to go to middle class, primarily white neighborhoods where like lawyers and professionals lived and talk to them about Bernie, our success rates were extremely low. So we were able to sort of prove in praxis that which we would read in the theory, which is that it's really class that matters. When we went to working class neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods, that's when we found the sort of people that were sympathetic, not just to Bernie's ideas, but to even more radical ones. I found that there was many a time when I would have probably been more successful at convincing people if the candidate that I was campaigning for instead of Bernie would have been a regular Communist Party or something. Um, there's this spirit that still pervades the Midwest where when you speak about the welfare state, which is basically part of the essence of Bernie's program, they think of it as handouts. So when you frame things in terms of power and the relations of production, relations of power within the sphere of production and the state, that is much more appealing to them. So I found various paradoxes, especially with farmers in the Midwest, with people that were used to like literally, doing their work and feeding themselves. I found that the discourse of just regular communism was much more successful than even Bernie. Um, so that was the second thing, right? We had the way America is viewed, the way the MAGA people are viewed. I understood the left was completely wrong. The left was treating them, in the words of Comrade Hillary Clinton, as a basket of deplorables. Or in the words of the leadership of the Communist Party today, as a fascist threat, right? And that was a very horrendous misunderstanding. The last one is perhaps a flaw less of the ultra left and communists and more so of the so-called democratic socialists, which is a superfluous term. Socialism is in itself qualitatively tenfold times more democratic than any class society that we've seen before that. But um, I went in 2019 with some of my buddies to the Socialism Conference in Chicago, sponsored by Haymarket Books, Verso, Jacobin, and the DSA. And in this event, there was a few panelists who were literally calling the socialist governments in Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, China, totalitarian. And I really couldn't wrap my mind around that. It seemed like for them, socialism has always failed. It's always led to mass poverty, repression, totalitarianism, and the worst things in the world, as Noah would say. Um, using the example of Stalin, he would eat your babies and your babies' babies and your babies' babies' babies. I'm sure that's an example he's used in this class. Um, so for them, socialism has always failed, and I found the attitude not just wrong, but incredibly arrogant. How can you sit here and say socialism has always failed in the global South, which is primarily where it's taken root, but it's going to be we, the virtuous Americans or the virtuous Europeans and Westerners, we're the ones that are actually going to make it work for the first time. It's like, our population has been so, um, lied to about communism. Uh, Communism has been so smeared, decontextualized, slandered, and you're going to call yourself a socialist, but accept everything McCarthyism has said about communism and what the junior McCarthyites of today talk about socialist and anti-imperialist states. That makes no sense. And the working class people who would accept, I mean, how would anyone accept what you're saying? Who the hell are you going to win over? If not people who already agree with you. So it was a way of thinking about the history of socialism that made no sense theoretically. Again, I come from a socialist country, Cuba. I knew that what they were saying was false, and I had done enough reading about other socialist states to understand that it was false and decontextualized, that they weren't able to understand the pressures, the hybrid warfares that the global capitalist imperialist system exerts on the country, on any country that even dares to have the slightest bit of sovereignty, um, and and and, uh, and socialism as a path of development for their nations. They get attacked with everything. Um, they tried to strangle the baby of the Bolshevik Revolution in its crib from the start, with invasions, blockades, everything. The whole program that we've seen play out with every single socialist and anti-imperialist state in the 20th and 21st century, it was played out against the Bolshevik Revolution. It was played out against the Paris Commune, where all of imperialist Europe united together to squash the communards. So I couldn't really understand how these democratic socialists were saying this. These speakers, who was it a mistake that they get the wrong speakers to do a panel? I looked around and all these, excuse me, but a lot of them were sort of blue-haired leftists. They were just clapping and they were going right along with it. They were very acceptant of the message that was being said. And that was completely foreign to me. I did not understand that. A few days after, Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal wrote an article together. That might sound weird for, for today, right? Because of the beef that they've had for some years, but they wrote a great article together showing how those precise speakers had been recipients of large sums of money from the NED and the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, right? The two so-called non-governmental institutions that are propped up in the Reagan era after the CIA has been delegitimized because people became aware of what it's done all over the world and in our country. And these new institutions became the way of doing what the CIA was doing before, but without the sort of bad branding that the CIA had already acquired in the vast majority of the American population. So here was a so-called socialist conference with speakers funded by the leading imperialist institutions telling us that socialism has always failed. I uh, I was perplexed. So these series of factors and lessons led me to reach out to Eddie in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, as we had finished our studies and embarked for myself at least on new ones in graduate school. It led me to reach out to him and say, we should start a blog locally to sort of prevent any of these tendencies from emerging, at least within the local spaces that we're organizing. Eddie, of course, decides to take the leap into TikTok, something that I very foolishly didn't think was going to work. He's always had a far greater vision and pulse of the zeitgeist than I have. Um, he went on TikTok. He started doing videos of Marxism and geopolitics, and utterly blew up. Within a year, we had 400,000 people, and it sort of uh, forced us to turn this idea for a blog into an actual institute, where now we have, of course, a publishing press, journals, website, YouTube show, classes, everything. Um, thanks to in part that effort, and also to I think the coherence and thirst for the ideas that we were learning and disseminating, and um, And so the way that I read the purity fetish, specifically the last chapter, is as a way of systematizing and giving coherence to the understanding of the flaws that we had been seeing for a very long time in the American left. Because at the same time as we were witnessing what I would come to describe as objectively revolutionary conditions, which doesn't mean a revolutionary situation. I think people misunderstand me when I use that term. It just means that the conditions are there. Like the suffering in the people is there, the willingness to act is there, the crisis in the ruling class is there, the unwillingness to continue on in the old way is there, the crisis of legitimacy. All of the central factors that in the history of the communist movement have been described as necessary for the presence of objectively revolutionary conditions have been there. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a revolutionary situation at hand. To have a revolutionary situation, you need subjectively revolutionary conditions. You need the sort of organizations that can do something about the objective conditions, and that have a certain level of coherence and systematicity to their thought that allows them to unite the people, give the people's thinking about the crisis some basic level of coherence. It doesn't mean you make the vast majority of the people Marxist theoreticians. It just means that they're able to understand that the individual ills that they face have a systematic character, and with that, direction. So that you can overthrow an order that it doesn't matter how much it wobbles, as Lenin said, it won't fall unless it's overthrown. So I understood that these errors in the left presented major fetters, major obstacles for the development of those subjective conditions, which have been necessary in the last, 20 to 30 years, where we've had basically perpetual, unending crisis. And whether it's political economists or political scientists, most tend to agree that the last 20 to 30 years has really been a process of perpetual crisis for the vast majority of the American people. So to think about how it is that the left uh, reached these flaws, and to think about it in an interconnected manner, um, we developed the concept of the purity fetish, because we come to realize that, as Engels would say in a letter, which I'm almost positive Noah has mentioned here, what all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. What was common to all of the flaws was a lapse in dialectical thinking, a lapse in dialectical thinking. And the positive form that we have come to articulate this absence of dialectical thinking is as the purity fetish. Why is that? Well, let me give you an example. Why is it that the nation's history is rejected and socialism framed as abolish America? Well, because as soon as the negative pole of America, the social totality pregnant with contradictions and constant movement, that's how a dialectical analysis would see it, because that's what it is. As soon as you don't have that dialectical framework, you just see the bad side, you reduce the whole and its movement to the bad side, and you develop a national nihilism, which says that nothing in our past is worth taking. Um, yes, everyone in the world has had to give socialism a national form, as Dimitrov said. Everyone has had to adapt Marxism, the general insights of Marxism, to the particular conditions and class struggles of one's country. But America's too evil to do that. We're uniquely evil. The paradox is here that what you have is a form of liberal tinted American exceptionalism. It's an American exceptionalism par excellence. It's we're the exception. Everyone has to give socialism a national form, but we're the exception. And that's the purity fetish, right? You expect a national past to be pure, and as soon as you have these objectively evil parts, it desecrates that purity, so you reject the whole thing. You condemn the whole thing. Or you look at the Trump workers, which MAGA, not Trump. A lot of them are able to distinguish Trump and MAGA, but you look at the MAGA workers and you see that, well, uh, these farmers perhaps don't have the most woke ideas in terms of gender. Um, they also wrongly assume, the leftists wrongly assume that on the basis of what Trump says about immigrants or something, that those are ideas shared by the MAGA working class base. I found that they supported MAGA in spite of the more bigoted remarks of Trump, not because of them, but it's neither here nor there. You'd see these impurities in terms of the social morality and social uh, moral consciousness of the MAGA working class, and they hold that they're not enlightened enough, that they're the basket of deplorables, and therefore worthy of condemnation, um, and the farthest thing possible from a sort of sector of society that we would wish to organize. Effectively, what you have there is not just a misinterpretation of the phenomenon, but you're fettering, you're creating an obstacle to organizing what is effectively, I don't know, 30 to 40% of the American working class in the heartland, in the part of America where there's still a little bit of industry, um, productive industry, right, which is the basis of capitalist political economy. You can't have all those levels of disconnected, abstract financialization if you don't have some form of basis in a productive economy, which is what uh, these workers engaged with in terms of their current profession or used to engage with before those jobs were exported elsewhere. So there you have the idea that these people are not pure enough. We're not, they were, the left was fundamentally unable to see the contradiction at play, the potential, so the capacity for development that was pregnant in this form of dissent that was the MAGA part of the working class. And in so doing, they break with the Leninist tradition, which says that even the backward parts of the masses should be appealed to. And the basis of organizing should not be the ideology that workers have, but the fact that they're workers. The fact that they're workers makes them the objectively revolutionary class. Um, and the task of communists is figuring out, like, okay, this is where different people are starting off in terms of ideas. On the basis of those starting points, where can I find the little rational kernels, the points of contact out of which I can move them from that current form of consciousness, what Gramsci would call the spontaneous philosophy, worldview that they have, and towards socialism. And that was something that, Eddie and I and the people we were organizing with in Dubuque, we found very easy to do with the Trump movement. So the left completely rejected that on the basis of the purity fetish. They were impure, therefore we condemned them. And the case of socialism couldn't be any clearer. The first time I ever developed the concept of the purity fetish, I want to say October of 2022. Um, it's on the basis of analyzing how it is that this so-called democratic socialist left understood the legacy of socialism. Because socialism didn't look to the letter of how Marx and Engels wrote about it in the critique of the Gotha program or in the manifesto or whatever, they would condemn these socialist experiments in the Soviet Union and the DPRK in China, Cuba, etc. It was a giving of primacy to this pure, abstract, disconnected idea. And on the basis of sustaining this sort of purity fetish, this obsession, incessant obsession with these pure ideas, they would reject the real world when the real world wouldn't live up fully to those ideas. And that's the farthest thing from a dialectical materialist approach. Our basis is the real world and its real movement and its real contradictions and its real interconnections. We see that socialism cannot possibly look like in the 20th or 21st century how it does in the text of Marx and Engels, because you still have the reality of imperialism at play. You still have other realities that are legacies of colonialism and imperialism, like certain illiteracies and backwardness that might exist in the population that has to be removed through education, and it's kind of hard to do that when you're fighting off imperialism. It's hard to think about dissolving the state when you have the question of sovereignty at hand, and your most important priority is the opposite. It's developing a strong state, developing the forces of production, the sciences, technologies, modernizing in general, so that you cut the international inequality that has been created between the imperialist countries and the imperialized countries, and are able to develop a state strong enough that can defend itself from the attacks of imperialism. That's the reality of socialism in the 20th and 21st century. It's what Parenti called siege socialism. It's socialism constantly under siege, constantly under attacks from imperialist hybrid warfare. And what you have with the American and parts of the European left is this purity fetish. They're what Parenti called pure socialists. As soon as the real world doesn't measure up to the pure ideas in their head, the real world is condemned on the basis of not desecrating the purity of those ideas. And so again, what you have there is a complete lapse, complete absence. There's no semblance of dialectical thinking there. It doesn't matter if the champions of Western Marxism and US Marxism write at the level of disconnected theory, great books about Hegel and dialectics. When it comes to understanding the actual world, they couldn't be any less dialectical in their assessment, while simultaneously condemning the Marxist Leninists and the people actually carrying forth revolutions in the global South and East of being dogmatic, of being mechanistic, of being non-dialectical. It's literally the turning of the world on its head. So the framework of the purity fetish is a way of thinking about the worldview, not just one mistake or another. It's a way of thinking about the worldview, the Weltanschauung, the connection of epistemology, so the way we think about the acquisition of knowledge, how we come to obtain knowledge, and ontology, the sort of basic claims about the world that we come to accept. The purity fetish is the worldview of the Western Marxists. And it's precisely because it's excuse me one second.
All right. Well, while Carlos is busy, real quick. Oh, there he is. Never mind. Go ahead, brother.
The purity fetish is the worldview of the Western Marxists. And I had this question asked to me recently in Mexico by a guy who said, how can you talk about the purity fetish of Western Marxism, but not talk about, other forms of fetishism that are brought about by the bourgeois world order? And I said, well, you should have probably read the book, because I start the book by talking about the origins of this outlook, not in Christianity, which is in part what Domenico Losordo, Roland Bohr, and others do. They try to trace, the errors of the Western Marxists to a form of messianism, millenarianism that is present in the Christian tradition that the Western left is inheriting. It goes way back. We have to ask, what are the philosophical preconditions for those Christian ideas? And it's the debates that were happening, philosophical debates that were happening 500 years before Christ in Greece, between, specifically in terms of change, the Eleatics, with Parmenides at their head and Zeno of Elea, and Heraclitus, who was a dialectical thinker, someone who Hegel would come to say that there's not one passage in Heraclitus that I do not accept and contain within my science of logic. So with Heraclitus, we have a thinker that is able to grasp the conception of a one that contains the many. This is one of the central questions in philosophy, the one or the many. Heraclitus says the one and the many. We have a totality, a whole that contains the many within it. Once you have that framework, you can think through contradictions, because contradictions is nothing more than a many in a constant struggle within a one, right? Heraclitus held that this one that contains the many is both as a whole and within it dominated by movement and change. The world is governed by flux. He has the famous passage that we can never step in the same river twice. Not only has the river changed, but we, the stepper, have also changed. And that everything is interconnected to everything else, and that what propels this movement, the engine of this movement, is the contradiction that are inherent within things. So we have here contradictions, the ability to think through contradictions, the ability to see things in their movement, the ability to think through totalities in motion, open totalities, and the ability to think through interconnection. On the other side, we have the Eleatics, where basically the complete opposite reigns. For Parmenides, to think of contradictions and movement and interconnection, which presupposes a conception of the many, is what he called the way of opinion. The way of truth, what is actually true, is the one. A one that does not contain with it any plurality, a one that does not contain within it any movement, and even less contradiction. So with the Eleatics, you come to have a conception of truth that is going to stick around in the philosophy of Plato, the way he treats the realm of the ideal. He accepts dialectics in the realm of the representations, right, in the physical realm. In the realm of the ideal of the Platonic forms, where truth is actually at, he adopts this Parmenidean Eleatic framework, which comes to hold that what is true is that which is unchanging, that which is uncontaminated by internal plurality. And this framework that is developed by Parmenides and the Eleatics gets accepted by Plato. It gets accepted by Aristotle, who's the person that develops binary logic. It's a great feat, important for its time, but in some ways needing to be overcome by dialectical logic. This is what Hegel points to at the beginning of the Science of Logic. He says, how have we had all of these developments in thinking, but yet logic, which is by definition the science of thinking, we're still operating with an Aristotelian logic from 400 years ago? And then he goes on to develop a dialectical logic. Parmenides gets readopted in Plato, gets readopted in Aristotle. And then comes the Christian world that Losordo sees as the root of Western Marxism, where at the beginning you have a Platonism with St. Augustine, one of the major theorists. Before St. Augustine, the Christian thinkers are called Neoplatonist. Then you have Thomas Aquinas in the 14th century, if I don't, 12th to 14th century. And St. Aquinas is working with Aristotle. He literally calls Aristotle just the philosopher. When Aristotle gets rediscovered from the Arab world. And then you have with Luther a return to Platonism. So either way, whatever Christian tradition the Western Marxists are rooted in terms of their thinking and outlook, the essence of the conception of truth, of the conception of how the world ought to be understood and how it actually is rooted in the Eleatic worldview. So that's something that I developed in the first chapter of the book, this distinction between the Heraclitean framework adopted and developed by Hegel and Marxism and this other framework. What happens in the Western Marxists is that they claim to pay homage to Hegel, to Marxism, but the substance of their worldview is shot through with the same assumptions that one can trace back to the Eleatics. So the basis of anti-dialectical thinking is the essence of the Western Marxists. And what I try to do in my work is show how that framework, so we're no longer thinking about one error, right? Or one part of an error, because Losordo says that the problem of the Western Marxists is a problem of temporality. In Marxism, we have this different temporalities of communism, where you have the near communism, which you see in phrases like the German ideology. We call communism the real movement of history that abolishes the present state of affairs, right? That's a communism as something near, dialectical development, immediately present. And then a little bit farther version of communism, which they describe as the dictatorship of the proletariat. At that time, Marx and Engels are thinking about it in terms of the abolition of wage, slavery, full social political emancipation, etc. And then communism as a very distant, remote, almost utopian future, where it's classless and stateless and moneyless and all that. And you see it in the Grundrisse, in the critique of pure, I was about to say the critique of pure reason, in the critique of the Gotha program. And so Losordo argues that what the Western Marxists do is they connect themselves to the long-term vision of communism to the detriment of the short-term, which is the one that the Eastern Marxists connect themselves to. That's a very limited framework. We have to ask, what are the preconditions for one accepting only the long-term pure vision of communism? And the preconditions is that purity fetish outlook, which completely negates any form of dialectical thinking, and by its very essence, de facto negates Marxism. It's not Marxism. That's why um, I don't think I necessarily do it in the book. I've done it since, but every time I talk about Western Marxism, I got to put the scare quotes within Marxism. Because if you don't have what Marxism is, which is a philosophy, dialectical materialism, if you don't have that, I mean, you can call yourself whatever you want, but you're not a Marxist. You're calling yourself, right? Um, a duck can go around thinking that it's a lion, but if it doesn't have the mane or the capacity, the looks of the lion, the biology, it's not a fucking lion. It's not a lion. It can call itself whatever it wants. It could put the hammer and the lion emoji on its profiles online, but it's not going to be a lion. And that's what we've had with the Western Marxists. The what Marxism is, this worldview that you have all been learning here in Noah's class, that we have been learning for those that are taking my class and in my class, it's not the one that the Western left, the Western Marxists are guided by. And the fetters, the obstacles presented to the organization of the working class in America are rooted in this worldview. The other thing I do in the purity fetish, and with this I'll wrap up, is demonstrate that this is not necessarily a spontaneous development. This didn't come out of nowhere. This wasn't just a general degeneration of what was once a good left that just turned bad by some reason. No, it was specifically promoted by the institutions of the imperialist state. And this is something that we can trace back to the Cold War period. Uh, for anyone interested, see, the book is around here. It's not around here, but oh, yes, it is. Frances Stoner Saunders, The Cultural Cold War. It details this very clearly. She's not a communist by any means, but she's an honest liberal, tracing the development of Melvin Lasky and how the Cold War program to attack communism at a cultural front is developed. And what the capitalist class realizes, it's not a stupid class. It doesn't have the same potential of insights that I think a working class standpoint has, but it's not a stupid class. What it realizes is that it has a system that goes into crisis every 8 years, every 8 to 10 years. And it's a class that knows ever since John Locke's second treatise of government that when people are oppressed, when people are needy, etc., what happens? They revolt, right? The language that we have in the Declaration of Independence of after a series of oppressions, the people can no longer, and then they explode. That comes straight from Locke, right? That's basic bourgeois theory. So they know we have these periods of crisis that lead to this discontent. They know that from discontent, you get the potential fermenting for revolution. They even know, and here they have completely accepted Marx's analysis, that each crisis gets even worse because instead of actually resolving that which led to the crisis, they just deepen it by expanding markets, by burning the commodities produced and doing all the things that happen in these crises. They create the conditions for the future crises being even worse. They know all of this. So what do? They create the sort of opposition that they can control. This is what has happened systematically since the end of the Second World War. They have developed, they have given billions of dollars, they have created dozens of journals, they have propped up dozens of institutes and institutions, and for disseminating, for creating, normalizing the compatible left. A left that, as I call it in the book, functions as a form of controlled counter-hegemonic opposition. So it presents itself as counter-hegemonic against the dominant ideas, but in reality, it is controlled by those dominant ideas and serves an essential function for the dominant hegemonic conditions. And that function is what Gabriel Rockhill has called radical recuperators. They literally are there so that when people dissent, the spaces that they see that they can go into are those of the compatible left, and then they get sucked into these spaces where these ideas, socialism has always failed. Yes, capitalism sucks, but we criticize it in a very culturalist manner, and we understand that socialism is even far worse, right? We have liberal authoritarianism here, but we have really bad totalitarianism over there in the socialist countries. Spaces that say, oh no, all white workers are settlers. If you're not indigenous, you're not a settler. If you're not black, You're not a settler. We have to divide. It's really a war of the black and indigenous against the settlers. And 1776 was a counter-revolution. The MAGA workers are fascists. All of these frameworks, what they promote is what the ruling class of the capitalist mode of life and of every other class society needs in order to survive, which is division and confusion. And this is what the elite has promoted. It's promoted people who participate in what Lukács called an indirect apologetics of the system. Before, when it was the case that capitalism could be seen as a somewhat progressive development from the standpoint of world history, always ignoring what happened to the indigenous and African people, of course, but when that was the case, it was easier to make a direct apologetics of the system. After 1848, when the bourgeoisie literally stomps the proletariat in Europe, the switch is towards an indirect apologetics. The best way to defend the system is to present yourself as a critic of it, but have that critique be ahistorical or transhistorical, right? Referring to the problems of the age as naturalized problems and not things created by the capitalist mode of life. Have it be culturalist. So instead of looking at the foundation, the economic foundation that creates that culture, let's just look at the culture itself. And it's in general a way of defending ideologically the system through what appears as a critique of it. And this is the essence of what we have with the whole new left phenomenon, with all the different posts that develop out of the academy: postmodernism, posthumanism, post-Marxism, post-colonialism. All of these different tendencies are systematically rooted in this compatible left that served the role of beating back communism. It served the role of being the champions of an intellectual Cold War, class war against the socialist and anti-colonial movements of the global South and East. That's the role that they play. And the left that we have today, born into an environment where this phenomenon has already been normalized, where the communists were long ago kicked out of the unions, where the Soviet Union fell, and the parties that were attached to it degenerated as a result, and were subject to all of these influences that before they had kind of been able to critique head front. That is the environment that the left that we deal with today is rooted in. And so it's, we can call it left. We can call it Marxism, but it always has to be put in scare quotes. When you promote in various forms, it doesn't matter how woke you present it at, when you promote division, when you parrot the narratives of empire on socialist and anti-imperialist states, there's nothing left about you. There's nothing progressive about you. There's nothing Marxist about you. So those two factors, that political economy of knowledge that promoted the fake left, the compatible left, in order to combat and destroy the real Marxist communist left, and then the worldview that's connected to that struggle against communism. Those are the two reasons why we have the problems that we have today in the development of the subjective factor, right? It's a problem of the fact that the Marxists are not Marxist, and they're not Marxist because of the efforts that the ruling class has carried forth for 70 plus years now in promoting the sort of so-called left ideas that fundamentally do not challenge the capitalist imperialist world order and promote in various more sinister and devious ways the agenda of the ruling elite of division, and condemnation of socialism, of treating the current world in a very Thatcherite manner as Tina. There is no alternative, very doomerist form of leftism that I'm sure all of you at one point or another have interacted with, either in regular leftist spaces or in the academy. What Kerry Shukrov described as the radicalization of the impossibility of exit. The radicalization of the impossibility of exit. And this is the foundation of the left. And if we want any movement forward, if we want to actually fight for socialism, advance the class struggle, we have to correct ourselves and remove all of these errors that were forced upon us and that we have inherited. We have to learn actual Marxism, in other words, and we have to be able, since the ruling class has been so successful in creating the image that that is what Marxism is for the working class of our country, we have to be able to delineate ourselves from what they're doing. If it comes to mind, either in your discourse, your rhetoric, or whatever it is, that when you call yourself a communist, what what comes about are ideas in the worker's head that resemble that form of compatible leftism, you've already failed. You've already failed because they want nothing to do with that. They want absolutely nothing to do with that. And that's not just a Midwestern reality. That's a reality for working people across the continental United States. So it's important not just to learn how it is that the Marxist outlook, an outlook based on seeing things in their movements, contradictions, totality, interconnection, leads us to the development of a concept like the purity fetish to understand these failures rooted in a long history of anti-dialectical thinking. But it's also important to do what we've been doing in these classes, which is learning the correct Marxism and creating the conditions so that when the organization arises, and you can bet your asses is going to arise sooner than you probably think, when the organization arises, the subjective factor is there so that the fetters, the obstacles that has prevented other organizations from advancing the class struggles uh, can be removed, and we can carry forth our existential duty to fight for socialism. And it couldn't be a more heroic fight that we have, not because we're special or anything, but because we're in the belly of the beast. If we succeed in our struggle, the boot is removed from virtually every country on the planet, not just from countries that have already won their struggle for socialism, but from countries that are still struggling and still waging that fight. So we have to, in short, uh, excuse my French, but we have to get our shit together. And I think it's doing stuff like this that creates the conditions for getting right, getting into a position where we can actually do what history requires of us. You know, be the agents of world history, the people that can help give clarity, coherence, unity, and direction to the dissenting American masses that are dissenting in various ways, but all dissenting. You know, only 11% trust the media, only 19% trust the politicians. These should be numbers that we should applaud, but also should force us to reflect on why aren't they mobilized in a socialist manner? What are we doing that, in the face of such a crisis of legitimacy, the American people want nothing to do with the mainstream socialist organizations? Those are questions we have to ask. We have to be self-critical. Um, and only by learning Marxism, only by adjusting that Marxism to the, the American context, right? Only then can we succeed in giving those various forms of dissent coherence. That means a better understanding of the crisis, unity, right? So that the Bernie worker and the MAGA worker don't see themselves as enemies, unity and direction. Show the people that it's in their power when they organize in a revolutionary manner to change the world how it actually is. That the world how it is something that came about historically, and that it's in their power to change it and to create a society that is of, by, and for the people. I mean, we live in a country where the people already accept as common sense government of, by, and for the people. What the hell is government of, by, and for the people if not socialism? Government of, by, and for the people is socialism. Because in capitalism, what we have is government and society of, by, and for big corporations, big investment firms, and big banks. Government of, by, and for capital. Of, by, and for the people is socialism. So, um, yeah, that's that. Thank you. Sorry, I've been rambling for quite a bit. But...
No, no, don't apologize. That was wonderful, brother. Thank you so much. You said something at the end there that made me think. Um, in thinking about why 11% of Americans trust the media, 19, was it 18, 19 trust the government, ridiculously low numbers. And yet the purity fetish left cannot ask the question, why aren't they with us? And it's the purity fetish itself preventing them from doing that, right? Because they have the pure ideas, and all of the impure people, they're the problem. And so it isn't what are we doing wrong? We're pure, we're perfect. We're never doing anything wrong. It's what is everyone else doing wrong? It is their fault they're not with us, not ours. And it prevents them ever moving forward. It also turns them into cannibals, right? As soon as they see a hint of an impurity in one of their friends or the people in their organizations, they all toss the word comrade around, um, enough to make it lose meaning. But one of their comrades, right? They go after them. They attack like sharks. And so it splits apart again. It's division based on impurity. But thank you so much for that awesome talk. I really think we got a lot out of it. I'm sure there's probably plenty of questions. So if you guys have some, you can start raising your hand, and we'll see if Carlos will stick around and answer a few with us. I do want to mention one other thing though, while people are sort of thinking of questions. There was a part during your talk when you mentioned the state, right? And how the purity fetish left can't really understand the need for a strong proletarian state. They can't understand this contradiction, right? Because they say, well, if you're developing a strong state, you're not withering away the state, right? They can't grapple with the temporal aspect of this contradiction. And we read from Engels on this, right, in this class, where he talks about this exact problem where people look at things as either yay, yay, or nay, nay, and anything outside that comes from evil. Correct? That's precisely what the purity fetish left does here. The state either is a thing or is another thing, is not one thing turning into another thing, right? And so building up a strong working class state is at the same time the same process of the withering of the state, right? The loss of its political character, because it's removing the need for the state to have a political character. So over time, that development, the effect, in effect becomes cause, right? And it flip flops. That was just something that I thought of while you were talking. But anyone who has questions, go ahead and ask.
Steph.
Yeah, I saw some people were posting your book, rightfully so. It's a great new release. I'm looking forward to getting through it. And I was just looking at some of the different responses from, this crowd. And one I kept seeing coming up is this formation of like the oppressed versus oppressor nations framing, which to me feels like an enormous dead end, because I don't know what you're supposed to do with that then. If you're an oppressor nation, I guess you have to say death to America, burn the flag, and all that. Just broadly, how do you feel about that formation, that term, and how do you usually respond to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think again, it's rooted in the inability to see contradictions. Because okay, oppressed nation. Does that include the comprador elements within it? The people that Marti used to refer to as worms with bow ties. That's where the offense of the Cuban diaspora, the anti-government elements that sell their homeland for a few bucks. That's where it comes from. Gusanos de corbata. Are those comprador elements? Are they also the oppressed? You know, it's and are the people struggling paycheck to paycheck? Are the people living in the street? Are the people that are zombified basically in their form of existence because of the pushing of opioids onto them by the medical industrial pharmaceutical complex? Are those oppressors as well? I mean, it's just fucking idiocy. It's the epitome of idiocy. This is why there's something to dialectical thinking that's just common sense. It's basic common sense to be able to see how this totality has certain contradictions. The Leninist position, yes, accepts that there are, of course, oppressor nations and oppressed nations in terms of states, not the nation itself. Oppressor states, imperialist states, and imperialized states, not necessarily in terms of nations, right? In terms of the Stalinist definition of nation. But it recognizes something none of these abstract third worlders do, which is that the goal of people in the belly of the beast, in these so-called oppressor nations, which are really oppressor states, the goal of communists in these positions is to show how it is not on the basis of some petty bourgeois moralism, right? But on the basis of a sober analysis, how it is that it is in the interest of the workers within and other sectors of society, progressive sectors of society, within the imperialist nation, to see how their self-interest, right, not just on the basis of empathy, to see how their self-interest is intimately tied to those that are struggling against imperialism. What does this mean today? It means showing the American people how it is the same assholes who keep them poor, who keep them indebted, who keep them desperate. It is these same assholes who drop genocidal bombs on the Palestinians, who give hundreds of billions of our tax dollars to doctrinaire neo-Nazis in Ukraine, who slander Iran and every country in the anti-imperialist camp. It is these same, so the struggles that Russia is waging against Western U.S. NATO encroachment, the struggle that China is waging against U.S. encroachment, attempts to delink them from the global economy and provocations in Taiwan, the struggles of Palestine and Ansar Allah and Hezbollah and Iran, the axis of resistance against the Zionist entity, which is an integral part of the imperialist system as a whole. All of these struggles, they're not just struggles we should support on the basis of some lofty ideals of empathy. No, they are fighting our fight. We're in the same fucking fight. We are in the same fight. If they win, we win. If they lose, we lose. It's the same imperialist state that is attacking them. It's the class struggle, the same class struggle taking place in different places at different times, but it's fundamentally the same class struggle, and they're on our side. So this whole junk that tries to reduce all of America to an oppressor nation and all of the global South and East to oppressed nations is completely it's simplistic, one-sided, anti-dialectical thinking, and it's the heart of the purity fetish, I would say.
I want to add a little bit to that. Every shorthand you hear develop on the left, every single one, throw it away. It will always lead to an incorrect idea. This oppressed nation nationalism, good, oppressor nation nationalism, bad, just another shorthand to throw away. Lenin and Stalin both go to great lengths to point out that oppressed nation nationalism can be just as reactionary as any other form of nationalism. It is only progressive when it is actually pushing society forward from the place it is at towards socialism. Papa Doc, for instance, in Haiti, right? Pinochet in Chile, nationalists of oppressed nations who were reactionary as all get out. Say what you will about the Black Panther Party and their lack of coherent theory, but they had this one sort of embryo of a notion that I love, which was intercommunalism. And Fred Hampton is speaking on this at one point, and he's answering questions about hating white people. And he mentions Papa Doc. He's like, look, Papa Doc hates white people more than anybody. but it didn't get his people anything, did it? It didn't. Of course it didn't. You saw what happened with him and Baby Doc both in Haiti. So I think that's important to remember. It's also important to remember that there is a difference between the right of nations to self-determine, which is a right, and what communists advocate. And Stalin goes into this in his Marxism and the National Question, right? Where he basically says that those two things can differ. At one point in time, Polish independence was very progressive, and at another point, it was very reactionary. He even goes into the reactionary nature of the nationalism of the Bundes and their federalism, right? He goes into that in detail, talking about how the federalism within organized labor and what became, which was the SDLP, the Social Democratic Labor Party, ended up turning the working class of different nationalities within Russia against each other. So you would have, Polish workers breaking the strikes of Russian workers and vice versa, because they set up this atmosphere of organization based on nationality first, rather than based on being working class first. And like Carlos was just saying, materially speaking, it don't matter where you're from. If you're a regular working class person, your interests materially are the same. They just are. And so putting that dividing line between us is precisely what the ruling class wants to do, and Stalin lays it out.
Can I add something real quick, Noah? It's really good that you bring up the nation's right to self-determination. Because again, like the way that this is treated is almost like this abstract universal principle. So abstract meaning, if we go back to its etymology, abstractus, disconnected. The support for national self-determination as a principle disconnected from the systems thinking through which it was understood by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and the communist tradition. As you mentioned, there's forms of nationalism, even in oppressed nations, that could be reactionary. When? Well, when they aid the development of the imperialist system. That's the importance of the systems thinking. Let me give you an example. Today, one of the most important philosophers and general theorists of China is Shang Weiwei, who has written on the Chinese civilizational state. He calls it a civilizational state in part because it's almost a state made up of many states and many nationalities. What do you think would be the woke version of balkanizing China, if not urging for all of those nationalities to self-determine itself and completely destroy the civilizational state? So that's what we have to look at. Where is it that these ideas of national self-determination actually aid the cause of progress, and where is it that they're used to balkanize states that are in a frontal attack against the imperialist system? There's ideologies today that are gaining more and more traction in this fake left, which hold that Black people are not Americans. Black people are new Africans. It used to be the case that the people that said, no, you Blacks are not American, were the racists. Now it's promoted under a woke agenda. There's that video that I think Eddie showed a while back where the racists and the woke, they start talking and everything's the same. And there's people literally saying that. What we need is Black people to all just go to the South and have their own state. It's just ludicrous. It's just segregation. It's negating what the whole Black freedom movement has fought for.
I'll tell you what.
It's not only not progressive, it's racist. It's something the KKK would say, "What's up? Yeah." It's so ridiculous. But that's a form of erroneous pro-imperialist way of framing national self-determination. that only serves the cause of division, of balkanization, at a time when the American people are more united than ever. The youth, at least, it is a lot more likely for the youth to be anti-racist than racist. Racism has become a joke. The people that are racist, they're laughed at by the vast majority of young Americans because it's ridiculous. It's irrational. It has always been irrational. And it's explicitly understood as such now. And now, when we have the conditions for more than ever for a multiracial working class struggle, now you want to balkanize and resegregate black people? Whose job are you doing? You're doing the imperialist job.
Mm-hmm.
Carlos, at the pro-Palestine encampment in my area, one of the orgs there was giving their talk, and they had a big map with their big slices through, and they say, this is where all the black people go. We're going to ship them all over here. This is the Chicago. I'm like, what decade is it? What's going on? This is like 50 years out of date.
I'll tell you what.
Next thing you know, they're saying we're gonna get them in a boat and we're gonna what? How do they not see how ridiculously racist this is?
Logistical nightmare too. How are you going to ship them all? Oh, crazy.
I'll tell you what, I'm from a black neighborhood, and if I went to where I grew up and started going around going, hey, you guys aren't American, I guarantee you I would not get out of there without getting my ass beat. People take who they are seriously, you know? A white dude running in telling them they're not American, that's ridiculous. Ridiculous. And they
that's
do
why
it with such confidence.
That's why these anti-America sentiments, they're anti-black, because you cannot have America without the contribution of the part of America that, on the basis of the fact that it's literally been the most oppressed and exploited, was able to create almost the soul of the nation. The best music, the origin of American music, is in the what was it that Du Bois called it in the last chapter of the souls of black folks. The soul songs, you can't have
to look it up.
You can't have Elvis, CCR, you can't have any of the traditional American music without the original contributions of the Black Freedom Movement, which are based in those struggles. You can't have the best artists, right? The role that the Harlem Renaissance has played for American culture. You can't have the best theorists or thinkers. How can you speak about America without Frederick Douglass? How can you speak about America without W.E.B. Du Bois, or without Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or Malcolm X, even a different tendency, or the black? You can't. So to be anti-American is, as a lot of this ultra left is to be anti-black. It's rejecting the fact that because of its role as the front line of the class struggle in the US, it's defined what America is. It's been at the heart of the American trajectory. And again, as dialectical materialists, we see things in their movement, in their trajectory. And it's been at the front lines of that trajectory. So if you reject America, you reject that whole legacy. And it's only the racists really that do it.
Does anyone else have any questions for Carlos?
I did have one more if nobody else.
I got a question for you, Carlos. The purity fetish of prior epochs, right? We talk about how it goes all the way back to the Greeks. So in previous forms of American history, especially when we're talking about now, like the sort of woke reaction to readdress the color line from the past, would you say that sort of the entire beginning of Jim Crow could be considered a form of the purity fetish, 100%. And why?
Yeah, it's all about sustaining white purity. I mean, the conceptions at the root of white supremacy in this country, there are many ways even more racist and narrow than the Nazis, right? The percentage of Jewishness that someone had to have to be considered Jewish was a lot higher than in the US, the level of blood quantums that would desecrate you into being a non-white. So yeah, that's it's almost the archetype of the purity fetish here in the U.S., specifically in the pre-civil rights era, where there's that explicit institutionalized de jure, so legally sanctioned white supremacism and basically apartheid state, the state that emerges after the counter-revolution of property of 1876. We have, slavery, a slave revolution, a black proletariat revolution, freedom for 10 years, and then the re-enslavement of black people, specifically in the form of apartheid and lynching and the horrible system of Jim Crow that emerges. And philosophically, what's the central way of legitimizing that at the level of ideas is this idea of white purity that we have to sustain. And that's coming back. It's coming back strong on places like Twitter and other places. It's not Twitter's fault, I think. It's just Twitter's where we're seeing that microcosm. And I hadn't really noticed it until all these races that developed an audience outside of Twitter were led in by Musk. So I'm kind of thankful to Musk because now I know that they exist. I thought that anti-Semitism in 2024, white supremacy, I was like, what the fuck? But then you see, idiots like Lucas Gage and Fuentes and others get an insane amount of clicks, and you're like, wow, this has survived quite a bit.
Mm.
And I recall I think it was Engels, the first one who said this, even though someone else, August Bebel might have been the one that popularized it, but anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. People know they're getting hit, and they, if someone tells them that's the guy hitting you, they can't really see it immediately, but they're so angry, they're so discontented and beat back that they'll just swing at anything. And that's why we have to be there.
I recently saw a very good quote from Engels on this. And now I'm going to use a word that is not PC, but he does not mean this in the mean way. He means it in a more literal way. He says that anti-Semitism is a sign of a retarded society. Not meaning like developmentally, meaning that it's going backwards, right? The growth has been slowed to a point of going backwards. But that one's been, around quite a bit. Yeah, that'll be the 20th time I'm canceled, I'm sure. But it's true. It's our society is decaying at such a rate that this anti-Semitism is returning, and it's botted to hell. I mean, these people are in my replies to my random posts about American Marxism, and anytime, like, you can look, they all have low follower counts and whatever, so they're clearly gaming it in some way. But anytime you actually pin them down on why they think what they do, there's no reason. We have the truth on our side, and I think it's really important that we combat these people head on in the war of positions. When they say, oh, Jews control everything, we make the case that, look, one, you're wrong. In the US, the elites have always been WASPs, always been white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. You could go down the list with 30, 40 names. I mean, Rockefeller, DuPont, Morgan, Chase, Ford, et cetera, blah, 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 right? But even if they were correct, which they aren't, we can actually look at what causes disastrous effects within society. And in 2024, that's financialization, right? That's the fact that stock price is manipulated rather than actually a company creating value in the economy. And we'll go over this next week, by the way, with reproletarianization. It's all this stuff. And if you list all that out, they will always run screaming away from it. They will not be able to address a single thing you say. So say it and keep pointing out that they cannot deal with what you're saying. They're hiding behind their memes. They're hiding behind something you already explained. Keep going over it. If they can't stop, don't stop. People see that. And they see us beat them every time we bring the facts with us.
Nothing serves the Zionist entity more than those people right now.
Mm.
Because before any of them were let in, I think one of the arguments I was making is that, I mean, it's very clear that 99.99% of the anti-Zionist movement is not anti-Semitic. I mean, I had not seen one actual anti-Semitic thing from any of the accounts that were sharing pro-Palestine content until these people are let in. And now it's absolutely everywhere. Who does that serve? Which entity is premising its genocide on the basis of anti-Semitism, of claiming that the whole world is anti-Semitic? Which entity or series of entities is limiting speech, beating down student protesters on the basis of claiming that people protesting the funding of a genocide with their tax dollars is anti-Semitic? So who is really on the winning side of this spread of real anti-Semitism? As Danny said once in a stream with me, no one benefits from anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, more than the Zionists.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, it was just an observation, but one thing that I notice in the purity fetish left is this dynamic where they often seize on these sort of, the return of racism or the JQ type stuff, which doesn't seem organic in many ways. It definitely seems like there is some sort of like artificial sort of element to that. And then what they do is that they point at that and they say, look, this is why we need to defeat fascism, or this is why we need to defeat MAGA. And and the role that that plays in terms of diverting people back into bourgeois democracy or back into bourgeois electoralism as a way to continue the system when we need to be thinking outside of this duopoly of the political system.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know what I also think it is actually, sorry, go ahead, Carlos. I don't know why I'm answering your question for you.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The same dynamic that you have with anti-Semitism and the Zionists, you have it with the spread of these other bigoted ideologies and a left that just wants you to vote Democrat until the planet explodes. And I think that, look, it's not the case that, these, there isn't moments where these ideologies have to be challenged and confronted directly. Of course, when you have literal militias of racists with weapons actively attacking minorities, then you realize convincing is probably not the best route. The best route is you grab your fucking weapon in a video game and you go out and you engage in what they're asking for, basically, because you're not asking for it. But we're not at that moment. We're at a moment where the reason why these ideas are accepted by people, one, they're proliferated by the elite, but the reason why they're being accepted is, again, because they're looking to dissent. There's no systematic framework that they can engage in any of the media that they consume to help them understand why it is that their lives are shit. The leftists that they encounter cancel them because they don't introduce themselves with their pronouns. And there's these people that are not very woke that tell them it's the Jews or the immigrants. And what that does is give them a target. Tell them, oh, these are the bad guys. And then they twist a few things. And what time are they going to have to actually do the research to realize that it's complete bullshit what the racists are telling them? So the strategy at that point, when that question is still one basically of the war of positions and not of a war of maneuver, is convince them. Because in convincing them, you win one to your side and you remove one from the side of the racists as a double whammy, a similar double whammy to what the general strike of the black proletariat in the U.S. South produced, right? The South not only lost It's productive base by black workers going north, but the North gained soldiers and spies and workers, etc. It was a double whammy. I think that's still the stage that we're in. It might change at some point. It might be fermented by the elite to change. But right now, it's still a stage that if you have a coworker that has some bigoted views about immigrants, that has some ridiculous views about Jews or something, you can probably talk them out of it. It's at the it's at the stage generally for most people of what one of our friends of the Institute has called soft conspiracism. It's a form of conspiracism that could be removed fairly easily. Once it turns into hard conspiracism, into hardened, fixated beliefs, that's when you're going to have a little bit of trouble. That's when perhaps they're grabbing arms and doing the sort of crazy shit we've seen fascists do in the past. But insofar as it's soft conspiracism, it's just an idea they're at, and they'll have another one that changes it in 2 weeks. We can talk to them. Not only can we should. That's what we should be doing.
You know, this makes me think of something that both the sort of purity fetish left and the weird Fuentes types, anti-American people hate, is that they are on the same side.
Yeah.
And they really cannot stand when you point that out to them. All of them end up doing the job of the ruling class for it, right? Pushing people away from real solutions into political actions that fundamentally cannot and will never challenge the system.
That's
All
the
of
real
them
horseshoe theory.
seem to attack us at the same time, right? The American Communist movement that's growing quite a bit these days, they see us as the number one threat. And so this basically puts them on the same side. If you ever want to make them angry, just tell them that. Believe me, it will work.
Jeff.
Yeah, I got one comment, one question, I guess. So the comment is what I've seen with, at least in my view, is on Twitter. It's people are brave when they don't have to face you, right? But when there's flesh, it's right. So how much of that is just cowards saying stuff because they're in the dark, and another part of it is like how much are actually. I kind of wonder because a lot of these are accounts, sex bots, whatnot, right? Or they have 3,000. They're following 3,000 and they've got two following them, right? It's like, what's the point of even responding? Um, so I don't know. I think a lot of it's that. I honestly don't know what extent of it is. I'd be curious to know, but it's kind of really not that big of a deal. The main thing I wanted to ask was I was reading. So I got your ebook, downloaded, I printed it, started making notes. I mean, I love it. Right, it's excellent, and it gave me two references, a bunch of references, but two that I've actually. One Parenti's book, and then the other one is the Western Marxism by Losardo. I want to get it, but it's like I start getting too many books and I never read them all. So I'm going to put that one on the back burner and just focus on Parenti's. But in the first section, it's chock full of things I had to stop and read and look up this term, look up that term, right? I keep a running list of words I don't know, concepts I don't, blah, blah, blah. I'm wondering, is there something you could recommend, like maybe a say an Oxford philosophical dictionary or thesaurus, something that would help me to grasp the concepts quicker, right? I don't have the time to be able to go and study everything like with a philosophy degree, but I would love to be able to go and say, okay, that concept, let me dig into it a little bit more and have a quick reference. Is there some sort of reference like that you could recommend?
Yeah, first, I mean, thank you very much for your comments and great question. I mean, the first, I, I'm a philosopher, so I had like, my 4 years of the undergraduate degree, and like ever since then, 6 or 7 of graduate degrees in philosophy. And so that first chapter is a product of like the sort of institutionalized understanding of the history of philosophy, I would definitely recommend if you're interested in like learning about that history, there's a bunch of really good history of philosophy texts. I can send out a list for those interested. Um,
Definitely.
yeah, there's a lot. I mean, one of the things I really appreciate is reading through those. And there's also prominent philosophers that have done their own history of philosophy texts. Bertrand Russell, and the one that I pull the most from is perhaps Hegel.
Mm.
That's within my tradition, but there's many others. As far as like immediate finding of concepts, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is probably the best. It's overseen by actual professional philosophers, and there's very long entry articles on different concepts, schools, thinkers, etc. So, I remember when I was in undergrad, that was like the one thing I was always reading whenever something came up that I didn't know. You also mentioned
Stanford,
uh,
Stanford
oh,
what? I'm sorry. Stanford what of philosophy? I'm sorry.
Stanford Encyclopedia
Encyclopedia.
of Philosophy. Yeah,
Thank you, thank you.
it's amazing. I recommend it to anyone that's interested. Because it's actually like they're long articles, probably 40-50 page long articles, and they're done by specialists in that area. So you're not gonna get like Wikipedia sort of encyclopedia stuff. Um, as far as your other question, which was very interesting, concerning how many of these bots are actually real and if it's worth interacting with them. And I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of these accounts are probably fake, um, or bots or stuff like that. But we live in an era um, of what some scholars have called prophilicity. That means that central to how we curate our identities is profiles. I mean, I'm sure you all have met many people that their conception of their selfhood is tied to their profiles, right? And who they are is indistinguishable from the profiles that they curate, right? And what they post is in many ways conditioned by the dialectical interplay of these positive feedback loops between what they post and what the general peer reacts to it. The stuff that gets likes gets posted more. The stuff that doesn't get liked gets removed or not posted again. So what happens when we see a lot of these bots and people commenting and stuff, even if they're fake, they have to be combated because being in the era of prophilicity, it means that the major form of observation is second order observation. People are not necessarily seeing things directly, but they see them as they are being seen. Before you watch a movie, you look at the ratings. Before you go to if you have the option of going to two Taco Bells, one of them has a 5 star. Online, one of them has a 2 star. Which one are you going to go to? It depends. If you want to be all night in the shedder, you go to the 2 star one, but you're likely going to go to the 5 star one, right? You're going to judge it on the basis of how it's been judged by other people, by this conglomerate of the general peer. So when it comes to online interactions, and this is something that we're trying to improve in terms of our base of readers and listener, it is essential for everyone to comment, to like, to share, to do all of that. Because it's not only getting the word out, but it's also affecting the perception, how new people are seeing us because they're seeing us as we are being seen. So the content might be amazing, but if in the comments you have 30 haters and 29% of 29 of them are bots, it doesn't matter. It's going to influence the perception of the content by newcomers who are seeing it not directly, but how it's seen as being seen, how it's being seen by others. So that's the importance of bots. And what ends up happening in our stage of bourgeois ideology is that a certain judgment on a certain affair is promoted by bots. But because of the character of second order observation, what ends up being initially a fake and manufactured opinion on a subject ends up turning into a real one, because real people end up seeing it because of the bots. They end up passing their judgment on the thing on the basis of how other people are passing that judgment, not knowing that they're bots, and then they end up adopting it. And so what was the position of a bot ends up being turned into a position of a real human being. So it's essential for all of us, whenever we're online, to tweet, to retweet, to comment, to do all these things, because it affects how people are going to see the content itself, which they see through how everyone else is seeing, not just directly.
Yeah, and that's something we've really been focusing on learning about lately. I want to say we're a few minutes out from the end of the class today. We have a couple more questions, so let's get through these. Coco had one that she typed out. Daniel, did you want to? I saw you say you read it, so I didn't.
No worries, go for it. Go for it.
Oh, I don't have it up.
Coco asks, is Trotskyism a form of the purity fetish?
Yes, it's one of the first forms of the purity fetish. The socialism in the one worker state wasn't pure enough, so you condemn it and you critique it in such a manner that somehow the Germans following Mustache Man also adopt those criticisms of the Soviet Union, and then all the institutions of American imperialism also adopt it. I don't think it's unfair to say that the first champions of the most bullshit and Cold War critiques of the Soviet Union, the critiques that end up being adopted by Hannah Arendt and normalized by the Western Marxists, were the Trotskyites. That's just the truth. That doesn't mean that, perhaps subjectively they thought themselves as genuine revolutionaries, but in terms of substance, how they handled the contradictions that perhaps objectively were present in the USSR, how they handled those, were very readily instrumentalized for the forces of reaction, and therefore it became a reactionary tendency, not unlike how Western Marxism in general has become one as well. Now that's, not all thoughts are alike. There's one that comments on our YouTube, and that's always donating. That's like 21st century Trotskyism, which is kind of based. There's a few trots that I met in Mexico, old school trots, all in favor of actually existing socialism, pro Iran, pro the anti-imperialist. They were amazing. They were just more sympathetic to Trotsky's ideas than Stalin's, right? There's some people that are like that. There's a lot of people we've worked with that are like that. I think Alan Freeman and Radica Desai are like that. I think those are the people that, although they like Trotsky, they get called Stalinists by the Trotskyites. So, yeah.
Pramat.
Oh, hello. I from your class as well as Carlos' class, I have started to see the dialectical thinking, and I think I'm hoping to adopt that thinking. And today's lecture about the purity fetish, as well as the why the Western Marxists have those Western Marxists have limitation. May I add to one more thing to what Indian Marxist Vijay Prasad has been complaining about is the Western Marxist. Basically, they are ignoring the other side of the world. They are ignoring the class struggle that is waged by other part of the countries. Yes. Such as if you look at the American Westerns, they are totally unaware of what is happening in India, what is happening in Vietnam. At the most, they have some idea about China, but not in other parts of the world.
Mhm.
And I think, what do you have to say about on this?
I couldn't agree with VJ more there. He's someone I cite a few times in the purity fetish. He had this historic comment towards David Harvey, someone who, he sympathizes with the countries that are struggling against imperialism, but doesn't really adopt the Marxist-Leninist framework on imperialism. He said, what was it? He had a retort towards him. You
I
live on the
remember it if you don't.
you live on is it you live on the other side of imperialism or
Yep,
something like
that's it.
that? You live and it's true.
Yes.
A lot of the Western Marxists, it's a very Eurocentric or American centric perspective that they have on the world. And I don't mean that in a woke way. I mean that quite literally. The way they think about the rest of the world is shaped by the institutions of American empire. And one of the things that Losordo notes, Jeff had mentioned Losordo's Western Marxism. The book comes out next month. I had the honor of a monthly review sending me a copy before, and I'm working on a review right now. That's what I was working on right before I got in. But so look out for it. It should be out next month. But one of the things that Losordo notes in that book, towards the end of it, is that if you look at like what Hegel and Marx and Lenin had on their table at any given day, they had newspapers from basically all over the world. If you look at like the explicit comments made by Horkheimer or Adorno or other champions of Western Marxism, they have no clue what the fuck is going on in the rest of the world. They're not reading anything but the American press, and that's if they're reading the American press. They're not reading I mean, so yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a very narrow vision, and you see it in the critiques. It's not to say that anti-imperialist and socialist state can't be critiqued. The purity fetish is not saying that we must have a reverse purity fetish and raise to the level of perfection. No, there's obviously contradiction, and you don't overcome contradictions by digging your head in the ground and ignoring them. You have to address them. But how do you do it? You do it in a spirit of constructive critique, in a spirit of camaraderie, in a spirit that is cognizant, knowledgeable about the internal debates that these processes always have. You can't sit here and criticize Cuba without understanding the plethora of different debates and positions that Cuban communists have on the issues at hand. So that's how we can do critique, and none of that is anywhere near the Western Marxists. Their main theorists, the little guys that just publish in the journals and no one hears about. None of these people are reading Iranian, Chinese, Cuban, Russian media to get a balanced view of the bullshit that the American media feeds them.
Really well said, brother. All right, with that, that's gonna wrap us up for the night. I want to thank you again, Carlos, for your help tonight. This was awesome. I'm sure everybody had a great time. If you have any other questions for Carlos, feel free to email them. He will get back to you. Don't worry.
And get yourself a copy of the new book, please. It helps. I think it will help you educationally, but it also helps us financially as well. It's a good way to contribute to the People's Institute. Oh, there we go, Aaron. Nice. And
It's an
Steph
amazing
as
book.
well.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very good.
It's a lot shorter. It's a sort of book you could probably read in a sitting or two. Um, I think that's the way to go about doing books nowadays.
Yeah.
Although the next book is 400 pages.
Well, speaking of books,
Contradicting myself there,
the
but
primer for reproletarianization. By the way, my hard drive died. Was it 4 days ago?
yeah.
And that was the one that my working copy was on. Right? I tried everything to try to get it back, and I couldn't. I took it to get a new enclosure in the hard drive, and they were like, "Nope. If you want your files, $2,500, we'll send it to a forensic thing." And I'm like, "No, no, no."
No.
This
CIA has a
morning,
copy.
well,
CIA will have a copy. Okay.
check this out. This morning, I'm like, "Wait a minute. Last week I sent this to Danny." And so it was in my sent mail, and thank God, because it's like almost done. And now I only lost a week of work. So that's awesome. Anyway, you guys don't care about my adventures in hard drives and them going kaput on me. But Next week is the class on reproletarianization. I want to remind you that next week will be when we assign essays. If anyone now they're not like mandatory. If anyone wants to do an essay, we will be reading them and posting them on the website for those who do. So the subject of the essay is where you were with understanding Marxism before taking the class and where you are now. Yeah, and that'll do it for today. So just keep that in mind. Start thinking about that if you want to do one. The last class we did, people did all kinds of different creative forms. You don't have to, doesn't have to be an essay. Someone wrote a play. It was wild. So yeah, whatever you want to do that gets that information across, it's on you. We will see you next Monday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. And yeah, have a great week. Nikki, I know usually runs the after class discussions, but it's Canada Day, so she's out doing political work. I'm sure she'll do a makeup just like she did last week. So talk to her, and yeah, we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks, Roy.
Carlos.
Thanks,
Have a good one,
Carlos.
guys.
Thank you, Carlos. Take it off.